Ha ha ha, he he he, you are here and so are we. Ha ha ha, he he he, you are here and so are we. Hello Felicity, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Enjoyed the lovely heat wave that we're having and hoping that we'll get a little bit more of it soon.
The 1 day heat wave, it's kind of getting a little bit cooler over here already. You get everything crossed it stays. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast, and I'm really excited to kind of get involved and talk about everything. So, first of all, if we can just kick off, could you share a little bit about yourself, your work with children as a creative consultant, and your work in education?
For many years, I worked in a primary school in Manchester where I worked up to being an assistant head and I led behaviour for just over 6 years, I think it was. And within that setting, I worked very closely with the children and the staff and did lots of coaching and applied lots of research with how we could empower children. And when I started my own family, as many mothers do, I realised that I just couldn't continue to work in the same way. 18-hour days full time was just not conducive to family life for me. Lots of people do it, but not for me. So I decided to leave and start my own business and work a bit more flexibly. So that's how Fledgling Education was born. Um, and during that time, I've done so many different wonderful things, ranging from tutoring over the pandemic to support those children who fell back in their confidence mainly, all the way through to being commissioned by the Commonwealth Games to do some work on inclusion at grassroots level in sport. And I'm currently working within local primary schools to design and deliver some art and film projects.
Oh, fantastic. So you've got a whole range of different skills that you're kind of applying to these different areas. That's really interesting. So tell me a little bit about fledgling education and what it is you do as a whole.
So initially, what I wanted to do is to go into schools, look at their curriculum, and look at how, in a creative way, we can engage children and empower them throughout their learning journey. And I was very lucky to be asked by the Commonwealth Games to run their primary project, which was all about going into schools, looking at inclusion at grassroots level, and not necessarily celebrating um, difference in sport, but making sure that everybody was welcome and celebrating these messages through the use of films. So we created music video style films that were then shown at the Commonwealth Games and kind of touched a lot upon diversity and equality and things.
Fantastic. That sounds really interesting. And did you have quite a positive response from that?
Yes, absolutely. So we in total did 5 films and it was all at a primary level. The children designed the content. So, for example, one film, it was looking at stereotypes between traditionally female and male sports. So, looking at gymnastics and football and making sure that every child felt included in those different games if they wanted to play them. And we had some attention from national press. And we put on this huge event where they were shown in like a cinema style way, and we had some MPs come, and all of the schools came together to really showcase their work. It was lovely.
Oh, I bet it was. It sounds lovely. And how do you think that these like children engaging in these artistic activities and these creative activities benefit their development?
I think what always lies at the centre of my work that it is designed and led by the children. For me, whenever I start a project, I ask the children their opinions and their views straight away. And I mean, you can say the same when you work within a primary setting. You know, for me, it should start by asking the children and then build up to what the senior leaders want at the end. It's usually the senior leaders who then, for me, um, want to make the children's ideas a reality, if you know what I mean. So, for example, this last art-based project that I've done, we were looking at freedom, and we wanted to translate our thoughts about freedom, but based around the school values. And the children came up with, they wanted to explore that idea of being free and where that comes from. And lots of children talked about nature, and we talked about, well, why is it, is it the oxygen, is it the colors? So we decided to look really close, and this was all from the children. We decided to use a microscope and look at digital images of grass. And we realized that actually, grass, when you take a cross section of it, there are little smiley faces inside. So that really resonated with the children and their sense of happiness and freedom. And we used that, as well as, looking at oxygen underneath the microscope, looking at sound waves, because we're often connected to our environment by what we can hear. And they use that as inspiration for their artwork.
That's really brilliant. And do you find, obviously, you've got a lot of experience working with children as an assistant head, do you find that children kind of respond differently to that type of learning as opposed to sitting in a classroom?
Children now are getting a lot more used to working collaboratively. So our classrooms generally across the board are a lot more set up, and teachers use a lot more different techniques to working together. And there are lots of subjects which lend themselves very well to the investigative approach. So going from a question and exploring that way. And like you were saying, the work that I do naturally starts from the ground up anyway. And I always find that children, if they are interested in finding a solution to a problem, whether that be a maths one, a grammar one, a science one, if they're the driving force behind it, then they are more likely to not just succeed, but accept the times where they are going to make mistakes and they are going to fail, in inverted commas, um, and they're more likely to keep propelling themselves forward and stay motivated.
Fabulous. So, have you got any advice for kind of parents who are working with children at home and want them to learn different things, something that they could apply at home?
I think my first tip would be, if you're struggling, take the children outside and find a link between what you have in your mind and what you want them to learn. Find a link with something that is tangible, something that the children can hold, something that the children can see. Find something that gives purpose to a problem, so that they're not just trying to solve something on a piece of paper. It's real. um Also, I often come back to the three different types of learning. I mean, there are lots of other different types, but the first one is concrete, which is where you give children opportunity to actually hold things and work things out. Then you might go to more of a pictorial method, where you draw a diagram of what the children are holding. So if I give you an example of that, if you were doing a maths problem where the children had numbers on a page, use anything in your kitchen or outdoors to try and give a visual or something that they can hold to represent those numbers. Then you might draw a picture of what you've used, if you use in pasta shells or lentils or whatever, and then you can finally apply the numbers on the page, if that makes sense.
Shall we talk a little bit about lockdown and your tutoring throughout the pandemic and helping children and I guess adults with their mental health and well-being and that side of things? I bet that was quite tough.
Yes, and what I found, the common theme was that it was more self-confidence, that the children had the skills. But number one, I do think that some children were deeply affected coming out of a social context for so long, and then going back into a very busy classroom and not feeling able to put their hand up or contribute in group activities. but also they lost a little bit of confidence in their ability to do things, because naturally, of course, there are going to be gaps, in learning. And that's just, the response to what happened, really. um, but I really, really am thankful for that time. I ended up tutoring, I think it was up to about 8 children, and I ended up doing some children when we were able to, in person, and I had really positive feedback. And like I said, I'm glad to have had that opportunity.
Absolutely, and it's kind of, you take a positive from a negative situation, and you had that opportunity to work with these children. So these children that potentially were struggling with their confidence, or putting their hands up in class and things like that, what type of work did you do with them to kind of get around that?
If I'm being honest, I didn't work specifically on the mental health and well-being side, because as a tutor, really, I was brought in as an academic tutor. However, I did use a lot of, um, not necessarily just praise and rewards, but more patience and empathy, and trying to understand their thought processes. So rather than, there was lots of stars and stickers, and well done, and extreme, I'm impressed, look at that. It was more about, saying, take your time, what are you thinking about, what's making you feel nervous, shall we work through this one together. Another absolute key thing was modeling everything you expected, the child to do. So I would never ever sit with a blank piece of paper and give children a question and say, right, so let's work this out. It was always, here's an example question, here's how I would do it. Can you try and do that one now? Do you get what I mean? So you're always giving children a scaffold, and it's a difficult one to get your head around, because some adults would say, but I want them to do it on their own. But no adult, if you're in a real life context and you're not sure how to do something, I would hope that you would ask somebody for help, or give you an example, give you an example of something to do. So modeling in that way is key. And also, one final thing on that is modeling a thought process, because we often, can show children how to do something, but we're not showing them what's going on in our own brain. If you're doing a recipe with your child at home, it's perfectly okay to say, hang on, I've forgotten how to do that now. I need to look at that again, and model all of the things that you're saying in your head, so that the child knows, oh, it's okay to question that. It's okay to check that. It's okay not to know things all of the time.
That's a fabulous idea. And also, it's instilling that confidence again, isn't it? But in a different way. So it's a great idea for mums, because I know we've got a lot of mums that listen to this podcast. So if there's something that they're doing at home with them, if they, as you say, model it out first, and that the child's always watching like a sponge, taking it all in.
Absolutely. And it's really important to throw in a few curveballs, so that your child can see that you've just overcome something. And it's okay to model getting a bit frustrated, because you care about something. So if something goes wrong, it's fine to show frustration and explain frustration. I feel really frustrated. I was really looking forward to that. But oh well, maybe I could, get around it by doing this, or I'll probably feel better in a few minutes or whatever, and really show children that with the emotional spectrum, everybody feels these feelings, but it's about processing them, communicating them with somebody that you need to communicate them with, and kind of channeling those emotions into a positive thing.
Absolutely. And do you find that this also is very beneficial to children with additional needs that perhaps maybe struggle with the emotional regulation and that type of thing?
Well, the emotional regulation is such a difficult thing that a lot of us as adults take for granted. And I'm not, there are times when I'm not very good at regulating my emotions, and a run is the only thing that will help me, or removing myself from a situation is the only way that will help me, so that I can process and so that I can think, what was it that really annoyed me then? Oh, it was when that person said that, or why did they, and it's such a complex thing. I believe that it isn't until children are 7 or 8 that correct me if I'm wrong, but their brain can't actually physically, it's not wired to be able to regulate emotions in itself. So, of course, children who have additional needs in that area are going to need more support, more modeling, more empathy, more patience, and more, you know, constant revisiting of modeling of how to process those emotions.
Because it's not something that's taught, is it, as such? So as you say, all of this modeling and empathy, this is kind of helping and supporting them along the journey, because it is a big thing for a child, isn't it? Why do I feel like this? And yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in the past, this is something that I'm working on at the moment. I'm in the very, very early stages of developing an app, because in the past, we very much, even subconsciously, by giving emotions colours. So by saying that happy is green and anger is red, to me, and again, this might just be me, but to me, that suggests that anger is bad because red is like stop, danger, no, and being happy is green, and that's brilliant, good. That's what everybody wants to be all the time. Which, of course, when you relate that to real life in society, that just isn't the case. There are times when you can be too excited and too happy, and you can't concentrate. If you were driving and you were too giddy, that isn't something that is conducive to good driving, is it? And again, anger, you can channel that and you can say, I'm angry because I've seen something that I don't agree with, and that's unfair, and I'm not going to stand for it. And you can use that anger as motivation to, I don't mean stand up for yourself physically, but be very verbal about, no, that's not okay. So I think it's about now exploring these emotions and firstly labeling them with children, but also, exploring these emotions with them. What happens physically, when you're feeling these, and then how can we use these emotions or process them and communicate our thoughts and feelings so that we can release them and then bring ourselves back to a level, if that's appropriate at that time.
That's such an interesting way of thinking. So my little girl, bless her, she does struggle sometimes with these emotions. So from her nursery, we've got this sheet, and it's got, how are you feeling? Number 1, green and happy, and number 5, red and angry. And like you say, it's like, it's not always wrong to feel angry. Some things are going to make you feel angry, and it's not a bad thing. It's just kind of working through that and working out why and what you need to do to kind of make, like, kind of channel that. So that's really interesting.
I feel that in society now is the time to really slightly tweak and adjust our approach to emotions and how we model them to our children, but also how we are with them ourselves. I can have a disagreement with my partner, and sometimes the debrief of the disagreement can last longer than the disagreement, because it's so important to go back and revisit and say your apologies, but also, unless you explain, why did I feel this way when you said that, and there's usually a really big broad reason behind it, then you cannot build empathy with that person. And I think with children, it's really easy because we're so busy. We've got so much to do. I mean, my housework right now, I'm sitting in my kitchen and my house is an absolute tip. And, I've got pick up with the two of them later on, tea time, shopping, we're having a garage built at the end of it. There's just too much. But sometimes when you shattered at the end of the evening, at those trigger points when, my youngest child is going through a bit of a biting phase at the moment. It would be really easy for me to say, right, Bodhi, stop biting. Tallulah, go in the other room, separate yourselves. But instead, it half kills me sometimes when I'm shattered. But you've got to say what was happening when that actually happened. Okay, so Bodhi was trying to tell you that he wanted the toy that you just taken off him, and the only way that he can explain that to Lula is by lashing out. Yes, it's not okay what he's just done, and he's going to learn that over time. But he's using the only tool that he has. And sometimes it's so hard to go in and unpick every single incident. Having said that, this is so real to them in that moment. Nothing else exists, does it? They don't have housework. They don't have all the other pressures that we have. This is the huge moment of their evening.
I think it's really important to put yourself in their shoes. So an example I have, the other week, I went to collect my little girl from preschool, and when she saw me at the door, no mummy, no mummy. And after speaking to the nursery teachers, and she had a real breakdown, and speaking to the nursery teachers, they said, oh, we were all in a circle, and they were doing like a circle time, and it was Eleanor's turn next to stand up and present to the group. And I'd come at that point that she just wanted to, she was building herself up all morning. I'd come at that point, and the emotions just came, and she got frustrated, and obviously had a tantrum, and that's the only way she can express herself. So it's so important to step back and understand that side of things, isn't it? That empathy.
I know. And you feel for them so much as well, don't you? When you do unpick it, when you do realize, and what I always try and do is relate it to something that's going on in my life. So I use the example with you earlier of, if somebody comes and takes a toy from them, even if they're not using it, I think, well, how would I feel if somebody came into my wardrobe or went into my makeup bag or took something that I wasn't using, and then when I came to get it, how frustrated I would feel, and I think that is key, to try and always relate it back to something that is relative in your world, so that it gives you sometimes that extra little bit of patience when you're completely frazzled and you just want them to stop shouting and screaming.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a really nice way of kind of turning it on its head and thinking of it in a different way. So, for all our listeners at home, if your little one gets upset, try and understand a little. I know it's hard, but try and understand a little bit more from their point of view. You mentioned your app. Could you tell us a little bit about that? It sounds very interesting.
My app is still in the extremely early stages, and it's based around that emotional spectrum that we were talking about before. And for me, emotional regulation is broken down into process and then the subsequent communication. So using words to explain to somebody else how they were feeling, why they were feeling, and how they're going to move past it. So I want to develop a tool for primary schools, for private nurseries, that they can use, not just child friendly, because as you were saying before, and this isn't poo-pooing anything that's already existing, but the emotional regulation at the moment tends to be emoji based, happy, angry, sad, whatever. I want to make it very clear to children that all of us are on an emotional spectrum, and you can feel several different things at once. And I want to use a tool that the children can input data, let's say, throughout the school day, which then maps it for the teachers. The parents can have access while they're at school. And it gives an idea of the emotional mapping of that child, but also allows little moments within the day for the teacher to assess what emotional state the class in, either as a whole or as in individuals. But it's still at the research and development stage. And I'm actually looking for anybody to come forward so that I can gain their opinion on it, really, as a little bit of market research. So I'm speaking to school leaders, I'm speaking to parents, anybody who works in nursery, or anyone in this type of field that would potentially use it. So if there is anybody who would like to get in contact, that would be great.
I think that's really nice thought as well. You said that so the teacher can kind of assess the mood, so to speak, of the class, but also I guess it's quite nice for the child to have a tiny bit of time out and just to think, how am I feeling, just to check in with themselves. So I think that's a really nice thought. So will this be something that you plan to kind of roll out in all schools and
Ideally, yes, it would be something that, primary schools would be able to use and access throughout the year. What I really want is, just a stable tool that is used as a way of training staff as well. Really going back to these emotions all of the time, so it's just completely embedded in the practice, really, that there are these pockets of time, and like I said, for a whole class or any individuals that might need it throughout the day.
that's amazing. And is there anything at the moment in schools that schools do to check in with emotions, or is it only when a child is kind of struggling that's when that comes into play?
From my experience, schools are very, very good at being reactive to children's emotions and really trying hard to put things in place, particularly with additional needs. You know, all schools that I've ever worked in, their um, priorities are always with the child and wanting the child to be in an emotional state that is conducive to effective learning, really. In terms of what is already out there, in the collection of schools that I've worked in, there isn't necessarily something that data can be inputted on, but that's not to say that it's not happening. Like I said, at the moment, I'm very much in the stage of using behavioral psychology research to inform my practice. Um, but I would really like to hope that what I am offering is something different and is a lot more accessible for children. And again, it's going back to not subconsciously labeling these emotions as good or bad.
I think that's really good. As you say, I think that good and bad emotions does need to go, and there needs to be a little bit more understanding, doesn't there, around okay to have these emotions. So, kind of to tie this up now, what advice would you give to parents or teachers or nursery workers, whatever, how they can support the emotional growth for a child's early years? Can they support it?
In terms of early years, I did teach in reception, but really I can only go, that was only a very short time, and really I can only really go on what I do. And I'm not necessarily saying that this is right or wrong. I mean, we all endeavour to raise our children well, don't we? Um, but the tactics I tend to use are always, first and foremost, we all break sometimes and we all use loud voices and we all snap. And I think that's part of being human. When that happens, it's really important, I think, to unpick that with the child and say, I'm really sorry that I raised my voice then. It's because the tap was going, Bodhi was crying, there's a dish that's fell out the floor, blah, 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 but I am sorry and I didn't mean to. But if you're ever doing like conflict resolution, or if a child is in kind of crisis, or if you're dealing with an episode of behavior, the first thing I do is very calmly take the child away. Not as in like you're being removed because, but what I like to do is create a safe space for a conversation. So in a very calm way, go and sit somewhere that's private for you and your child. And if that's out and about, just moving away from the group. And then instead of asking why the child did that, I always start with what just happened, what happened before, how were you feeling when, why, and then start to get into the whys and the hows. How could you have handled that better? I understand that you felt frustrated. I would have felt frustrated, but you can't show frustration in this way. What would it have been better? How do you think now that you can move forward from this? So if a child has lashed out and done something, you know, I understand why you might have felt this. However, you've hurt somebody. What are we going to do now in future? And what are we going to do in this moment? How are we going to make that other child feel better and safer because they don't feel safe now? Because blah, blah. I do, I have to say, I am not one for rewarding and punishing behavior. The main reason for that is, and again, no judgment to anybody else, but the main reason for that is I want my children to grow up and intrinsically want to do the right thing. So not fear doing the wrong thing because they're not going to get something, or they get something taken away. Or I often think, so if I reward my child for doing something, what happens when I'm not rewarding them? Are they not thinking that, that they are worth praise, if you know what I mean? So it's a bit of a tricky one, isn't it? But I try and celebrate with, praising very specific things rather than saying what a clever boy. I would say, um, Bodhi, you've picked up that thing really well using your fingers, so coming away from labels and things.
Well, thank you so much, Felicity. I've really enjoyed our chat. We've touched on so many like good things, and I think a lot of the mums at home will take away a lot from it. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me.